Hey friends, it's Will and welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for joining me again. Today I'm going to be making a absolutely gorgeous watch strap out of one of the most beautiful pieces of shell cordovan I think I've ever touched. Now, you might be familiar with shell cordovan from the shoe industry. It's quite famous in the US for being used in shoes. It does, however, make an absolutely beautiful watch. And it's so hard wearing. Now it comes from the tannery, quite thick. I think it was about 2mm. And I don't really use anything that thick, so I had to split it down. And before this, I wasn't actually certain whether or not I could split shell cordovan, because it's kind of a backwards leather. The finished part, which you see the colour on, the outside, is actually the underside when it's on the animal, and you shave down to the bottom and then you shave up to the top basically, and that's how you get to the shell itself. It's a membrane around the muscle of the horse butt. But what that means is it makes an incredibly strong and hard wearing item, whether that's a shoe or a watch strap or wallet, whatever it is. But I don't actually use it very often. I don't really use it for much at all, but this client requested shell cordovan specifically, and I am very glad he did, because it turned out stunningly. Now, you see me marking 3 lines here. The middle one is where the turn is going to be. The 5mm away from the edge, where I've just skived down to give it a nice transition, is the turnover itself. It's where it transitions into the lining. And then the closest one was where that turn folds over to. I always use veg tan as the padding, as the body of the raising strip, if you like. Lots of people call it lots of different things, which is why I'm tentative about what I call it. But the padding strip, I always use veg tan. And the reason I always use veg tan is because if you use a foam, that can break down, because foam does like to break down when it's in these sorts of things. But if you use veg tan, it molds to you really nicely, but it also doesn't break down inside the watch, so it makes it last a lot longer. Now, I struggle to see center lines, and the center line of this is incredibly important, because if you get the padding strip slightly to the wrong side, your stitch lines look very bizarre on the outside. So I'm really careful when it comes to lining up my padding strips, because I want it to be exactly central. And I'm using a little tweezer here just so I can line it up perfectly, ready for the lining to go on, and then obviously fold it in half and then lining to go on. But you have to scratch the surface off shell cordovan to glue anything to it, because it is so shiny, so you have to do that first. But this is the only leather I ever use for the inside of a watch strap. It is called Zermatt. It's from Tannery Hat, and you can get it from one of my links in the video description from Leatherbox. And it is specifically designed for this particular purpose. It is hypoallergenic, which is really good for this. And it also doesn't get affected by sweat at all. It's almost waterproof in nature, which is why it's so amazingly good for watch straps. So we're going to glue what I've just scraped off. So it's only a 5mm glue over, which helps make the transition really smooth, because you can skive the edge down to 0, and then you won't feel any of that transition on the underside of the watch strap, because you don't want to feel a bump on your watch strap on your wrist. It'll make it really uncomfortable to wear. Don't forget to tap your glue down, because that pressure from hammering it down will help the glue adhere to it properly. And the other thing to note is, because shell cordovan is so waxy in the way it's tanned, you do the underside as well as the top side, you do have to put a lot of glue on it, but also make sure that that glue sets entirely, so you can see it's gone completely clear. before you actually try and stick it together, because if it's even a tiny little bit too wet, it won't stick. Shell cordovan is really hard to stick together, and you'll see when I do the edges that I'm actually using a sealer first, because putting edge paint on shell cordovan is as difficult as gluing shell cordovan. It just doesn't stick very well, so you do need that that bonding surface with, well, I find it very useful to have that bonding surface with the edge sealer, because then you can actually get your edge paint to stick to it. In the past, I have found that if you try and put edge paint on shell cordovan without sealer, it does end up just peeling off a little bit, which is not great. Now, I have become quite fond recently of using 2.7mm stitching irons, pricking irons. Normally in the past, I've used 3mm. I always use 2.7 for watch straps, but I've become quite fond of using it for other things, and I've got a wallet coming up shortly that I'm making a video of, so don't forget to subscribe for that. But for 2.7mm pricking irons, which is, like I said, what I use for this, I find M40, which is 0.35 or 0.45, I can't quite remember, millimeter thread, which is what I'm using for this, the best, because it gives the most beautiful angles when you're actually stitching it. This thread I get from, it's a Misi superfine linen thread, and I get it from Leatherbox, and I've got a link to that in the video description as well, so you can pick that up. And I also have a €5 voucher code if it's your first time ordering from them, so don't forget to use that to save a little bit of money. But now this is stitched, it's time to trim off the lining. Now, I always cut lining a little bit wider, because when you're stitching it, it pulls that lining leather in, and it allows you to get a much nicer edge when you're trimming it off as well. Because if you trim it off first and then you stitch it, you can often get just a little bit of shrinkage of that lining, which ends up to be very annoying. Now, this is the edge sealer that I talked about before, and it helps that edge paint that follows it to stick really nicely. As you can see, the edges are looking absolutely gorgeous. I'm not going to show you all 9 million layers. No, actually it was about 5 layers, but I'm not going to show you those because that will bore the living daylights out of you, and I don't want to bore the living daylights out of you. Now it's time to make the other side of this watch strap. I do need to sharpen that knife before you tell me in the comments. It is a little bit dull, but that's what sharpening stones are for. It's the same procedure on this side, but what you've got to remember is that the gap between the raising strip, which I'm putting down now, and at the furthest end of that strap, there is a 10mm gap. Now that is, might actually be 20mm now I come to think of it actually, but that gap is so that the keeper that you stitch in actually has room to be stitched in, and if you make that gap too small, you have a bump where your keeper goes. So you want that gap to be about 5mm wider than your keeper is. Now, with the lining for the buckle side of this, which is what this part is, it is very important to cut that lining strip quite a lot longer. And the reason for that is after you've folded it over, if you don't cut it too long, if you don't cut it long enough, you won't be able to get the right length of lining. Because in the way that I'm doing it here, I don't know if this is the same way that you're planning on doing it at home, but in the way that I do it, I punch the prick marks after I've put the lining on, which obviously is normal, but because of the way that it works and the way that you have that last final stitch over, if you have the lining too short, it won't line up properly. And again, this is a 2.7mm pricking iron, which I am rather fond of now, and I think I'll be using as much as possible. Not on things like belts, because it would take 10 zillion years to stitch a 2.7mm belt. And this is exactly the same Misi thread. It would be a bit bizarre if I was to use a different Misi thread for one side as the other, but it's exactly the same thread, and again you can get it in the video description from my link from Leatherbox. I love this thread. I really do. It's so consistent, and yes, it technically is waxed from the factory. I like to wax a little bit more, and I like to put a little bit of PVA or white glue on the tip so that you can actually seal that thread in that hole. That is really satisfying, snipping all of those off. Now, I didn't include how to make the keepers, and the reason I didn't include that is because they take quite a long time to make. If you would like to know how to make your keeper strips, let me know in the comment section down below, and I'll make a video just on those, because they are a little bit, they require a little bit of finessing to get the sizes right. This is what I was talking about, those over stitches. Obviously there's one on each side, and the way that you get them to be tipless is you glue the hole shut, you snip the tail off each of those just like that, and then you poke those threads into the hole. I forgot right at the end that I needed to actually put a tongue hole in this, so I did that at the end. I didn't plan that in the pattern. I had forgotten that this is a buckle that has a tongue. And we are all done aside from the adjustment holes. The client wanted them at a very specific point. The great thing about bespoke made stuff is that you can have the holes wherever you like them. It's wonderful. And there we go. I'm going to let you enjoy these beautiful shots, and I'll see you next time. Have a phenomenal week. Take care, guys.